I am Liz Powell. I am the founder and head of G2G Consulting, which stands for Government to Growth. And we are excited to bring you today's webinar that will give you valuable insights for nonprofit advocacy and funding through the government. So this is what we're going to cover today, some basic background, give you the basics on how state government process works, and then how the budget process works in particular, as well as federal earmarks for Ohio nonprofits. And then we'll close out with an amazing conversation between two esteemed special speakers today, who will have amazing insights for you on how to navigate this process. And we will close out with some key takeaways and answer your questions. So if you have questions, you can start to pop them in that Q&A box, and we will take them at the end. And my job is to just kick things off with a little bit of background. So again, Liz Powell, founder of G2G, and I started G2G back in 2007. So we just celebrated our 18th birthday. We are a team of 11, and we are bipartisan. Most of us have worked in government, either on Capitol Hill or in the State House. I myself worked on Capitol Hill for several years for a couple of different members of Congress, and always staffed the health and social service education issues. And I'm an attorney, and I have an MPH, so I have a strong interest in health policy. And we as a firm do a lot in health access, health issues, and have become super active on women's health in particular, leading some interesting events around women's health advocacy, and trying to shape systemic change to address some of the major women's health gaps across the lifespan from head to toe. We have raised $531 million in government funding for our clients. Many are in that health space, health innovation, health access space, many beyond that, ranging from education to youth at risk programming, to cyber security, to all kinds of things. And then we have built really valuable coalitions with some organizations in Ohio, the Ohio Women in Government Organization, the National Association of Women Business Owners in Columbus, the Human Service Chamber of Franklin County, among others. And we really value those relationships with nonprofits and try to do programming to help the many organizations that are part of those groups. We've got offices in Washington, D.C., Cleveland, and Columbus. And we're very committed to Ohio in particular because I started the business out of Cleveland, right at University Circle was our first office. So we always have done a ton of work with Ohio nonprofits in Northeastern Ohio, but across the state. We have worked with several clients in Columbus area, Central Ohio, Youngstown area, spanning to Toledo, Northeast Ohio, and then some in Cincinnati as well. So we've done all kinds of things, from leading advocacy campaigns, building relationships, organizing State House days, Capitol Hill fly-ins, lots of congressional briefings and receptions, and ways to build relationships, educate, raise awareness about key issues, and then drive change in the policy process. We've crafted legislation, done lots of messaging events, super active on social media as well as traditional media, and lots of strategies just to direct funding and to shape the process. We've got the 531 twice, apologize for that, but the main thing is that when it comes to government, that is our core service. That is what we know best. And so we are very passionate about connecting people to government to make a difference. So we love working with our Ohio nonprofits, and we want to make sure all Ohio nonprofits know about all the opportunities that are out there on the state and federal level. So with that, I'd love to pass it to my colleague.
Sorry, I'm having technical difficulty. Okay. Apologize for that. I'm Becky Watts. Thanks, Liz. And I just wanted to highlight this slide, which shows some of the wonderful nonprofits in Ohio we've worked with over the years. It's been a journey and an awesome one. And this just is a small representation of all the cool work we've had the opportunity to participate in. So I'm Becky Watts. I am vice president for Ohio for G2G, and I've been working in this field for over 25 years, both at the local level of government. I started out municipal court, went to the State House for a few years, working for the first and only female speaker of the Ohio House. That was a privilege of a lifetime, and then went to DC to work for then U.S. Senator Mike DeWine during his second term in the Senate, and spent some time as his appropriations director. So had the opportunity to learn all the different ways that entities and constituent organizations throughout Ohio come to Capitol Hill to advocate for their needs, and in particular their funding needs. So I am going to spend a little bit of time just on some very basics to set the stage here for our conversations today. In particular, I'm going to talk a little bit here about state government basics. I think most of us know that state government is made up of 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. We will be talking a lot about the Ohio General Assembly today. That is a way we work frequently with nonprofits to advocate and to access funding dollars. The Ohio General Assembly is made up of the Ohio Representatives, which has 99 members, and the Ohio Senate, which has 33 members. There are 3 House districts in every Senate district. Senators are elected to 4-year terms with a term limit of 2 consecutive 4-year terms, and representatives are elected to a 2-year term with a term limit of 4 consecutive 2-year terms. So 8 years in total for each consecutively. The General Assembly, the Ohio General Assembly, debates bills proposed for adoptions to become law. A major vehicle that we will be talking about today is the state operating budget, which is a bill that is debated every 2 years by the General Assembly. And you know, a vehicle that a lot of organizations spend time advocating for. And I will be I will be advancing this to my colleague Matt in a minute to talk more about that. But just regarding these maps, these are the new maps that the Ohio Senate and Ohio House that reflect the current state of things. As you may have been aware, Ohio's experienced quite a few changes in terms of redistricting the legislative maps over the past few years. These maps reflect the redistricted legislative maps that will be used in the 2024 election cycle and go into effect in 2025. Currently, in the Ohio Senate, there are 26 Republican districts and 7 Democratic districts. And in the current House, there are 67 GOP districts and 32 Democratic districts. That may change slightly after the election, but just wanted to give you a sense of what these maps look like. The legislators that serve in these districts are the folks that you want to be talking to and developing relationships with on behalf of your nonprofit and the people that you serve. They represent you, they represent the people you serve, and the work you do for your communities. And they're very accessible, both in Columbus at the State House or in their districts. And not only do they serve your zip code, for example, but in their roles in the State House, they serve on various committees, and in some cases they serve in leadership. And they can influence, the process and the work that you're doing. So developing relationships with these individuals is a key part of your advocacy strategy. They each have legislative priorities, and it's helpful before you go and meet with them to research what those are, and then figure out where you align, and begin conversations with them, either again in district if you have an entity they can come tour, or going down to the State House and meeting with them there when the legislature is in session. Those are 2 key ways you can get in front of them and start talking about what your needs are and what you do for the community, and how you can be a resource to them. So we are going to get a little bit into the meat here of the state operating budget process, which is a way you can work with them. And I'm going to pass to my colleague, Matt, to cover that.
Awesome. Thank you, Becky. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Keys. I'm the Government Affairs Assistant at G2G located in the Columbus office. And prior to my current role, I worked in the Ohio House of Representatives as a legislative aide. So my background is firmly rooted in Ohio politics. And today I am going to be providing a little bit of an overview of the process and timeline of the state operating budget. So let's just start out by defining what is the state operating budget. So the state operating budget is a mechanism for the state to fund programmatic expenses by drawing down dollars from the general revenue fund, along with a few other sources of funding. We have a 2-year biennial operating budget. So every odd number year, we work on the operating budget that will fund the state for the next 2 years. Who is eligible? Nonprofits, colleges and universities, state or local governmental entities. I always just like to mention that for-profits are typically not eligible for state operating budget funding. What qualifies? These are programmatic dollars, whether that be to continue, expand, or create a program. Just as a, some clarification, these dollars cannot be used for infrastructure or capital improvements to a brick and mortar entity. That is a totally separate process called the capital budget, which occurs in even numbered years. And we actually just finished that process. So again, this is not for building upgrades. These are programming dollars. So how much funding can you request? 100,000 to 5 million is the range that we would generally recommend. Remember, this is a 2-year operating budget, so you can ask for 100,000 per fiscal year, and then it would be $200,000 total. If you are a well-known organization, for example, and you have a great relationship with the legislature, you may want to ask for, something a little bit higher, or if you are a little bit new to the legislature or perhaps not as well known, then we would recommend maybe starting out with something on the lower spectrum of that. I also just want to mention that the state's revenues are currently down $500 million from where they were projected to be at this point in the year. And while that can be attributed to a few things, the main reason for that loss of revenue was the consolidation of state income tax brackets from 4 to 2, which was a provision in the previous state operating budget. So if revenues continue on the trends that they are currently on, we can expect a tighter, more competitive budget process next year, simply because the state just will not have as much money to hand out. So what makes a successful budget ask? Economic impact. The more positive economic impact your project will have, the greater chance it has of being funded by the legislature. Proven results. If you're an organization asking for a continued line of state operating budget funding, the legislature will, of course, want to see, that these dollars were well spent and that they were beneficial to the community. But if you're a new organization seeking funding for the first time, legislators will want to look at what have you accomplished without state operating budget funding, and what could you build upon or enhance or expand if you were granted funding? Support letters, really a great vehicle to show community-wide support. These letters can come from your mayor's office, city council, county commissioners, township trustees. Board members is always a really, really key group of people that we always really emphasize the need to sign on to support letters. But ultimately, it could come from anybody in the district, because ultimately legislators want to hear from their district and, of course, take that into account when deciding what projects to prioritize. Broad legislator support. If you're a statewide organization, having support from legislators in all corners of the state was always really nice to have. If you're more local, which is perfectly fine, then having your local delegation on board is what should be your goal. I always like to say it's important to have Democrats and Republicans from both chambers supporting your request, regardless of the size of your organization. And that's just due in part because, every one legislator will appreciate having more than just them going in and advocating for, your project. It's always nice to just have like a group of people backing your project rather than just one. So essentially, the more legislator lists you can get on, the better off you'll probably be. Projects supporting the state's priorities. Any project that aligns with the state's current priorities will always be looked at in a positive light. So currently that could be anything related to, childcare or childhood well-being, access to food, access and affordability of housing, literacy initiatives, mental health, anything you see in the news, state's priorities will always be looked at in a positive light. Grassroots campaign kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of the things I just mentioned, getting your local community kind of involved in your request. And then tours, events, and testimonials. Inviting your legislators out so that they can see and impact your organization firsthand is always super, super beneficial when you go in asking for state operating budget funding or any funding for that matter, because legislators will have been there and they really will be able to understand with their firsthand experience what it is you're trying to do and who you are as an organization. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just a little bit of a timeline of the state operating budget process that will be coming up very, very soon. So I'll just go over this very briefly. So September through December, which we are very, very quickly approaching, is the time for preparation, which is extremely important for strategic purposes. So that would be the time to develop messaging, write some one-pagers, nailing down on what exactly the funding request will be, and just building relationships with legislators as well. Couple extra little caveats that I just want to mention during this timeline is that, as I'm sure that you all are aware, this is an election year. So we'll have to kind of wait to see who's coming back and who's going to be new in the legislature. But once we know, that can be the point where we kind of begin to pinpoint who we want to speak to and who we want to meet with in terms of a state operating budget ask. And also Governor DeWine is currently a lame duck governor. So he is, which means that he won't really have as much pressure now because he does not intend to run again, to maybe include budget provisions that would potentially earn him votes from Ohioans. So we can maybe expect a budget that will look a little bit different than if he were seeking votes. So should be interesting to kind of see how that plays out. So January through February, members of the General Assembly will be sworn in by then. So we will know committee assignments. We will know what leadership looks like in both chambers. And then this is the time to really, really start those meetings, which you will be doing a lot of during this process. We always say meetings are the name of the game. You'll always be talking to somebody at some point. And of course, the purpose is to talk to legislators, debrief them about your state operating budget request. And this also kind of coincides with when the governor's budget is released, which is typically around mid-February, which is kind of like a first draft of what the budget will look like. Then continuing into February and March, continue doing meetings. And then this will also be the time to find House of Representatives champions for your budget ask, as the House is the first chamber to kind of create their version of the budget based off of the governor's. So this will also be the time to testify in front of the House Finance Committee and the Subcommittee of Jurisdiction to once again debrief committee members on why you're there and why your request matters. And then in April through May, we'll continue doing those meetings, but this time it'll be in the Senate because the House will have released their version of the budget. So if you got in at your full ask on the House side, then really it's just a matter of keeping that momentum going, making sure you stay in the budget. If you got in at a lower amount, we might ask the Senate to bump up your request, or if you didn't get in at all, which does happen, then this would be a good time to find those Senate champions to really kind of carry that request across the finish line. But ultimately, regardless of where you land in the budget, it's just always a good idea to have champions on both the House and Senate. And then you'll also testify in front of the Senate Finance Committee and Subcommittee of Jurisdiction. So it's basically just a repeat of what you did in the House. And then the Senate will typically release their version of the budget in May. And then when they release their version of the budget in May, we'll move on to June. So we'll have the House version and the Senate version of the budget, which will both look very, very different. So in order to create a finalized version of the budget, they will go to something called conference committee, which consists of Democrats and Republicans from both chambers, and they will literally go through line by line in the budget and either strike things out or keep it. So this is where it's really great if you're in both versions of the budget and both chambers agree that your project is worthy of funding, then there really won't be any need to deliberate on it. It's not a guarantee, but if you could pick a place to be at that moment, it would be to be in both versions of the budget. If you're only in one version of the budget, then there will be some back and forth between the chambers so that they can kind of hash out their differences and kind of deliberate on whether or not that project should get funding. And then the budget will be signed by June 30th to start the fiscal year on July 1st. And then when you are granted funding, from July through September would be the thank you tour, as I like to call it, for the legislators, just to write to them, thank them for their time, thank them, for their championship, particularly those who were maybe a little bit more involved in your request or who really kind of shepherded your request through the legislative process. And then October through December is when the planning stages will begin for the capital budget, because preparation is so important. I cannot stress that enough, especially when seeking state funding. And I always like to say, it's never really too early to begin preparing for when you're going to the state to ask for money, because the legislators always like when you're nice and prepared, everything's in order. It can never steer you wrong. So I think that concludes with my portion on the timeline. So I will go ahead and pass it back to Becky to talk about federal earmarks for Ohio nonprofits.
Thank you, Matt. So continuing on in the vein of requesting an earmark, the federal level is a whole nother beast, but it is another opportunity for nonprofits to pursue funding through advocacy with your congressional delegation. So in our case in Ohio, that's made up of our senators, Sherrod Brown and J.D. Vance currently, and then your individual members of Congress, depending on where you are located in the state. Earmarks are a colloquial term at the federal level and are not formally recognized by Congress. They are now called two different things. In the Senate, they're called congressionally directed spending. In the House, it's community project funding. And essentially, this is one-time grant funding for local community projects that a member of Congress can choose to champion through the federal appropriations process. Funding for earmarks comes from existing federal grant program authorities. And essentially, a member of Congress, should he or she choose to champion your project through the process and succeed, it designates your nonprofit by name, usually, in the federal appropriations reports that go to the individual agencies, and then you do not have to compete through a typical grant process once that occurs. So then you work directly with the federal agency where the earmark was designated, and you draw down that funding. This infographic reflects the broader process for the federal appropriations timeline, in which the earmark process is a small but significant part. The White House is at the top. You can see typically submits their budget request to Congress in February. Following that, the House and Senate budget committees and the House and Senate appropriations committees in Congress begin working on their versions of what the president has proposed. It is around the same time that the appropriations committees issue their guidance as to what types of earmark requests they will accept in a calendar year. Each individual member of Congress has their own system for how they put out this information and how they intake project proposals from you as constituents. So your relationship development with members of Congress district staff, with their DC staff, getting on their even their email lists, newsletters that they send out, that is all crucial for you to understand when their individual deadlines are, what their individual requirements are, as you are considering the navigation of this process. Who is eligible? Nonprofits, local or state government entities, and institutions of higher education are eligible through this process. Each year looks a little bit different as to what appropriations committee guidance is issued and which accounts will be eligible. So to the question of what qualifies, it is one-year funding requests. That's kind of across the board. Matching dollars depends upon the account you're pursuing. Some accounts do not require matching dollars. It's always helpful in our view to go to Congress with a project that already does have some other funding committed, and you're seeking last in dollars. That generally speaking, it helps the viability of a project. Programming, equipment, or construction dollars are available through this process. Again, depending upon the year, this is a nuance that can change. This year, for example, the House of Representatives struck the eligibility for nonprofits to pursue equipment dollars through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. However, last year we pursued that process and succeeded. So really depends on each year and who's in power in Congress. How much funding can you request? We've seen earmarks in the ranges of $50,000 to $5 million. It really depends on the scope and sort of the breadth and depth of your project, who you're impacting, how many. 1 million is a more typical range, but again, and below, I should say. But we have seen earmarks for up to 5 million. What makes a successful earmark request? Well, community support, just like in the state level that Matt was just describing, is crucial. And in fact, in Congress, it's required in some cases. The House requires 2 letters of support at a minimum, I believe. This past year, the Senate, depending on the office, required letters of support as well. And these can be from your board members, your community officials, your state legislators, again, all the constituents that are involved in potentially benefiting from this federal funding can write to his or her senator, but you have to secure some of those, or member of Congress, you have to secure some of those to submit with your application, and that can really make a big difference. Key timing, February. Again, February is typically when members of Congress start putting out their their guidance, their what their intakes forms will look like. Some are very simple Google forms, some are more sort of advanced, sophisticated. Senator Sherrod Brown, for those of you who have submitted something through him before, has a pretty sophisticated system with lots and lots of questions that align to the individual account. So those timelines are typically in February and March. May through December is when, or I'm sorry, November is generally speaking when committee markups are happening. And this year, a lot of them have already happened in both the House and the Senate, I think almost all. And now we're moving into the next phases of that process, where the full House and full Senate has to take up those bills. And then generally speaking, they wrap up this process by December of a calendar year, although that changes from year to year. Just a few examples of projects we've worked on over the past couple of years while since earmarks came back into existence at the congressional level. The STEM Center of Excellence, that was a construction project last year for the Girl Scouts, over 800,000. Crime prevention and youth re-engagement programming for an education wraparound program. Infrastructure, lots of funding for infrastructure related projects are included through this mechanism, this vehicle. Again, violence prevention programming, STEM education programming, seniors, healthcare workers. You see things all across the board, different types of projects. So I think that wraps up my portion, and I will pass to Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky and Matt. That was great. And now that we all have a little foundation of what exactly is going on with the state operating budget and with federal earmarks, I wanted to bring up 2 amazing nonprofit leaders to talk a little bit about putting this all into action. So before we jump into that, my name is Andrea Harless. I am Director of Government Affairs at G2G. I'm currently based in Columbus, but I am from Youngstown, and I always like to mention that so everyone knows that Northeast Ohio has a near and dear place in my heart. So my background is in state government. I worked in the state Senate for a number of years for a member who was very active with nonprofits, specifically health, aging, and education, amongst others. I also spent some time at Franklin County Public Health before I moved over to work with G2G almost 7 years ago now. So a lot of my role is working with our nonprofits at the State House and with our Ohio delegation. And this is one of my favorite things we do every year with our webinar to connect with other nonprofits in the state. So I'm going to ask Charlita Tavares and Dr. Lynette Scotese-Wojtila to come on screen. There we are. So I'm going to quickly introduce both of these very remarkable women. And I love this matchup because Senator Tavares was a senator when I was in the State House. So it's hard for me to break the senator title. So I will probably continue to call her that. Senator Tavares is currently the chief executive officer at Primary One Health. And again, a former state senator, also state rep, also Columbus City Council member. So lots of different roles. And Dr. Lynette is president of Success for Autism. So while Senator Tavares was an advocate for many years and still is and has a lot of experience, Dr. Lynette is brand new to advocacy and did her first round of advocacy last state budget cycle and was successful in her ask. So we have people coming from different areas, which I think is really great. I'm just going to quickly introduce you to both of these women, and it was very hard to be brief because we have two very, very talented women here. So Senator Charlita Tavares is a local, state, and nationally recognized health and human services, cultural competence, and health equity advocate and policymaker. She previously served as the executive director of the Multi-Ethnic Advocates for Cultural Competence. She previously served as a member of the boards of the Community Research Partners, Access Health Columbus, Columbus Compact, the National Black Caucus of Local Elected Officials, National League of Cities Advisory Council. She also served again as a member of the Ohio House, the Ohio Senate, and Columbus City Council, and is a founding member of the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation. So thank you so much, Senator Tavares, for joining us. And then Dr. Lynette Scotese-Wojtila is a registered and licensed occupational therapist with over 30 years of pediatric experience. She is an autism expert and has dedicated her career to the transdisciplinary care of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. She holds a certification in sensory integration and is a certified autism specialist. In 1995, Dr. Lynette established the Integrations Treatment Center, where she later coined the Success approach, and she has made countless contributions to advance the field of autism, including the establishment of a nonprofit agency, Success for Autism, the production of a feature-length film called My Hiccups Are Gone, and done various lectures at the state and national level. Cleveland State University also honored her in 2018 with the Fascinating Alumni Award for her life's work in occupational therapy and autism. So thank you, Dr. Lynette. And I think we're going to pull down the slides so that we can see everyone. So I'm going to send my first question to Senator Tavares. So as a former legislator, what makes a budget ask successful? When a nonprofit leader sits in front of you and asks you for a budget request, what makes it successful? And at the same time, what do you not want to see? What do you not want to hear from them? Let's talk about the pros and cons.
Well, certainly the pros are sharing with the legislator how it's going to impact the residents specifically of their district, but in a more broad base, how it's going to impact the state of Ohio, because every legislator wants to understand how this is going to help their constituents specifically, but then how is it going to improve the well-being of residents of the state of Ohio? Because let's remember, as state legislators, they represent the perspective of a district, but they are state legislators, not city council members, not township trustees. And I think for me as a former policymaker and state legislator, I want to see the cost benefit analysis. And I think most legislators want to understand how an investment is going to help the community as a whole, but do that cost benefit. I think for negatives and things that you do not want to see as a legislator, you do not want someone to share their negatives. You don't want them to bring in a dismissive attitude or a condescending attitude, because maybe they don't agree with you on all policy issues, and that's a key. You don't want to threaten them. We've had individual constituents who are advocating on behalf of either their organization or something they believe very strongly in. And if a legislator has chosen another side to whatever that policy recommendation is, we've had constituents and advocates be threatening, dismissive, or condescending. And I think that hurts not only that organization that that individual represents, but also the relationship. Because if you start out that way, 9 times out of 10, you won't get another meeting with that legislator. And in some cases, they will work against whatever it is you are advocating for.
That is great advice. We definitely want to make, I always say when I'm going to a meeting with a legislator, I'm there to make friends. You know, we're there to advocate and we're there to make friends. And I can't think of anyone that is more sincere in her approach to talking about her organization than Dr. Lynette. So, Dr. Lynette, I want to ask you, last year was your first year advocating for state funding. So can you just share a little bit about what you learned? What was it like for you? You're brand new. I'm sure there are a ton of nonprofit leaders that have never done this before. What would you tell them?
Yeah, I hope some of them are watching today, Andrea, because I truly am the poster child for the novice, how to do this. As you know, from my background, I'm all about healthcare and children and autism. And so politics, is not my thing at all. So I was thinking about what I learned, and I would say there's probably 4 or 5 main things. And the first thing is that advocating for my cause, and those of you listening, advocating for your cause, it's going to take more than just being an expert on your topic. You don't advocate alone. You might be an expert, but you have to have a team of advocates that help you really get to the goal that you want to achieve. Another thing I learned, and I was kind of surprised because again, politics are not my thing and therefore politicians are not my jam. But I learned that legislators can be just as passionate about my cause. And they come at it from a different angle, and G2G has always helped me see what their role is and how to channel their passion with mine to get the advancements that we're looking for, in my case, to help those with autism. And in that process, I learned another thing, and that is the formality. Like there's such a formal process that Becky and Matt and Andrea and even Liz refer to, just in the whole structure of how our government works. This is kind of new to me, actually. And then another thing that came to be very obvious to me was just the terminology. I learned so much. I mean, a white paper. What is a white paper? Isn't all paper white? I'm like, what is a white paper? So I'm coming at this again from a very different orientation. And the folks at G2G, the way that they advocate, they almost took me in and gave me intervention to guide me in what I needed. They could sense that it wasn't my forte. They knew it was, and they helped me kind of get to what I was good at by helping me know exactly what to do in order to do it. So they educated me on the white papers. They told me what a bill was, just like they kind of advocated and educated us earlier in some of their slides. And that really went a long way to help me feel comfortable. So I would say one of the other things I learned is to trust the process because of the great support I got.
I love that. Those are all great points. And it's teamwork. It truly is teamwork. It's everyone working together to make it successful. So Senator Tavares, Lynette's talking a little bit about, being a new advocate. So why is advocacy important to a nonprofit? She said, I'm not a person in politics. You don't know much about this process, but why should you engage? I'm sure nonprofit leaders ask themselves this all the time.
And that's a very good question, Andrea. It's important for all of us to become advocates for those things that we really believe in, those things that are important to us or important to our organization or community that we live in. We can't expect someone else to do it if we're not willing to do it ourselves. And advocacy is something that a nonprofit needs to get comfortable with, because there are all levels of government that we need to understand their process. You can go and be a part of a coalition. Your organization can be one of many organizations that's advocating, let's say, for childcare or advocating for food security. Or you can be that lead organization because either your organization is one of the larger organizations or has been at this for a longer period of time. Advocacy is important for an individual. It's important for an organization. It's important for systems, and understanding who your champions are on the issues that are important to you. I say champions, it's an ongoing process. we have term limits. And I think Liz outlined the limits that state representatives and state senators have in the state of Ohio. What she did not share is she said consecutive, and we've got to keep that in mind because our legislators can go back and forth from one chamber to another. So today a state senator, tomorrow maybe a state representative, or maybe a state representative to a state senator. And so you've got to pay attention to who is still there. If you've developed a champion for your issue, you want to continue that relationship, whether they go to another house or not. And champions, you've got to continue to groom and grow champions because there are term limits, and some people choose not to go to the other chamber. And so it's a constantly building relationships, constantly developing champions, and even those individuals who aren't as interested in your issue, continue to educate them about what your issue is and why it's important to them and to the constituents that they serve, particularly if you can get any kind of numbers on the people within their district who either have, in Dr. Lynette's case, autism, in my case, who are underserved with healthcare.
The value of relationships is so important. And you're right. There could be new people. There are new people every 2 years. It's developing new relationships. You definitely want to strengthen the people that you bring in and are on your side, but it's always educating people. And that's really important. And Lynette, I know, had some great experiences. So I know Becky mentioned this as well, but one thing that's very important when you're advocating for your nonprofit is bringing them in to your facility, if that's possible. I know in some nonprofits that might be a little different, but bring them in and let them see what you do every day. You could sit in front of a legislator and talk about what you do all day, but as soon as they step foot into your facility and they really see it, that is like the wow moment for them. And I know, Dr. Lynette, we had lots of legislators come and visit, which you at ITC, but can you share a little bit about how some of these relationships with legislators has made a difference for you?
Yes. Well, I would say the relationship with you guys made the biggest difference because upon attracting you to Success for Autism and vice versa, I immediately procured my A team. A lot of people running nonprofits are looking for the just right people to help them. And you folks were that for me. And you led me as those strong leads and connectors to me, to the people who came to visit that you were mentioning, Andrea. And I think having people in your space, seeing you in action or your team in action, advocating and being the champion for your cause, it is contagious. This is the passion. If they didn't have passion already coming in, they do by the time they leave. And so again, trusting that process, kind of putting your guard down. A lot of times that what you do is very specialized sometimes, and you do things a certain way, and you have to be sort of open to people coming in and asking questions that maybe you never thought of because you're not coming from that view. You're looking through a different pair of glasses at your own program. And it's that diversity and different views that I think really helps to sort of broaden people's perspective, not just about what you're doing, but about where you can go. Some of the ideas that the legislators offered me to further this mission and really encouraging me to go for a bigger ask and, really clarify what we want to land at, that was very comforting. And so I would say one thing is this mental camaraderie that I got from them. And of course, the funding itself. I had one legislator actually through an omnibus vote process that I came to understand what omnibus was, kind of help push through the cause personally, and then called me at 10 o'clock at night, left a personal message, telling me that he advocated because it wasn't looking good, but then he kind of helped it look better. And you don't just get that kind of response. You have to, again, open yourself up and follow what you're led to know through the folks that do this every day. And that's the G2G team.
And Lynette, that's such a great example of building that relationship. And you found a friend in the process. And I know you found lots of friends in the process, I should say. But that is such a great example and how important those relationships are. Had you not had that strong relationship and found someone that was so passionate, there's a chance that the budget request wouldn't have been successful. But the fact that you had a great champion who went above and beyond, that's so perfect.
Agreed.
Can I just share something, Andrea? We just closed out National Health Center Week for all of our federally qualified health centers across the country. And we brought a number of legislators into our sites last week so that they could see firsthand. And we had 2 state senators and 3 state legislators who joined us at we took them around in our van, or they joined us by car. And what Dr. Lynette said is so very, very important. Sometimes when they see you in your environment and they see the people that you serve, it crystallizes for them how important the work that you're doing is. And so if you can get a legislator to come to your location, it is more important for them to understand what it is and who it is you serve.
This is such a great point. Yes, it's so important to get them out there and let them see it firsthand and talk to the people. Okay, so we're talking a lot about the benefits and the positives, but there are challenges. We know there are challenges. There are always going to be challenges. Senator Tavares, can you share some of the challenges in government advocacy that you've experienced, maybe as a legislator or as a nonprofit leader? What are those challenges?
I think one of the challenges is certainly having enough resources to give to everyone who's coming in asking for new or more revenue. You have finite dollars with which to spend, and you've got to make the decision as a legislator where you're going to make those investments, either new investments to share a new program or a new service for your constituents, or expanded resources for an existing nonprofit who's receiving funding from the state of Ohio. And so I guess for me, what we all need to pay attention to is that it's not forever, and that we need to look at how we use that investment by the state or the federal government to grow other investments, whether it's to pivot to another program or pivot to another funder. I think that's most important for all of us to understand, because the money doesn't continue to grow. It doesn't necessarily continue from one year to the next.
Great point. And I think part of this goes back to we were talking about how this investment helps, having that cost benefit, having those, being able to prove what you do. Why is giving funding to this worthy there are a million worthy organizations. Doesn't matter what you're passionate about. You know that there are 100 other things that are very, very important as well, but how that investment is going to make a difference, and that helps legislators know how to make that difficult decision. I can't imagine how difficult that is.
And in some cases, I just want to reinforce that in some cases, a capital budget is easier for people to make decisions around, because it's generally one-time funding. You're not going to come back and ask them for a new building every 2 years. You're going to come back for operating dollars for a program, but not for equipment and or the construction or renovation of a facility. And so the capital budget in some cases is easier for them to make those decisions. Of course, you have many, many other organizations that are advocating for their particular nonprofit or their particular entity to receive those dollars, but it's one time. So they don't have to assume that you're going to come back next year for more operating dollars.
That's a great point. All right, so we're getting close to our time here. So I want to pose one more question. I'm going to start with Dr. Lynette. What is your advice to a nonprofit leader that's considering advocacy? Again, as the newbie here, what is your advice? Someone's sitting there saying, should I do this? Should I not? Is it worth it? Oh, what should I do? What are you going to tell them, Dr. Lynette?
I would say probably a couple things. I would say, first of all, clarify your vision. Know exactly what you're looking for if you can. Look to your board for the clarity and try to envision in your usual strategic plan 3 to 5 years out where you want to land. And don't delay to secure the right help. As Andrea mentioned, I have a private entity, and I only found the folks I found because my accountant advised that there's got to be more out there. There's got to be some funding out there for your cause. The cause is so great. How could it go unhelped? And that's how I found G2G for the nonprofit. And once I did, what I really was impressed upon, and I encourage you all to just relish it if you have the luxury of securing services, they have the most phenomenal scope of programming and roadmap process that really kind of just embraces the newbie, helps them through the process, and this actionable step that they take, week after week, month after month, they just kind of march you very carefully through the process. So I would say my biggest advice is be clear about what you need. Don't delay in securing the services to get where you want to go. And as you're working with whoever it is, whether it's legislative or the staff in a lobbyist firm, just to help them understand your mission by standing in their shoes. Remember, you're the expert in your field. You have to sort of be able to talk their talk and embrace them for where they're at. And some of them are just as foreign to your program as we might be to theirs. So we need each other, and it's definitely a team.
I love that advice. I always say the same thing. When you're sitting in front of a legislator talking about your nonprofit, the expert in the room is you. You're there to teach them. That's their job, to learn from you. Thank you, Lynette.
You're welcome.
And then Senator Tavares, same question. What is your advice to a nonprofit leader that's considering advocacy?
I would say get with an organization that is familiar with the process, like G2G. Your team has been excellent in my work with the Human Services Chamber, and it's educational. And I think as much as we can get the education on the process before you step forward with an ask. You don't want to make a mistake. You want to be as prepared as possible. And the team, Liz and Becky and Matt and Andrea, the team at G2G has been phenomenal working with very small nonprofits and larger nonprofits throughout the state of Ohio. That's important. You want somebody with a success like G2G, and you also want to make sure that you're making the right ask. You're not making an ask that's very, very large when you're a very, very small nonprofit. And the question will be, how are you going to be able to sustain this growth with these kinds of funds? So you've got to be reasonable because there are many, many nonprofits that are asking for resources as well. And then just continue to grow your champions, continue to learn as much as possible about the process, and continue to help each other.
Thank you. That's great. Great advice. And I'm hearing from both of you, lots of planning and working together as a team. Thank you again, both, for your time. That was phenomenal to have such great women lead us through this. So I think we're going to pull the slides back up for a minute and just do some key takeaways. And then if anyone has any questions, I know there are some that are in the chat. We're going to try and get those taken care of. So I'm going to run through this very quickly because really this is the benefit of having awesome colleagues because they've went through a lot of this already. As Dr. Lynette and Senator Tavares said, some key takeaways here. Know your needs. What do you need? Make sure that's an appropriate need. Make sure, I always say, when you're asking government for funding, make sure you're going to be able to be a good steward of those public dollars. These are taxpayer dollars. We want to make sure we're good stewards of them. We got to understand the system. We have to understand timing. Timing is so key. We have to work on our relationships, developing a list of agency leaders, public officials, use strategic messaging communication. I love Lynette saying all paper is white. But white papers are a little bit different, and white papers involved a little bit of different wording and how we talk to different people. Relationships, we could just have this whole slide say relationships, and that is the biggest key takeaway. You need relationships that are long-standing with your new people, with your old people, making sure we have them all, knowing the process, inviting public officials out to tour so they can see you. As soon as they see you in your element, you're not in their office, they're in your place. They really understand what you're doing. Engage the community you serve. We love grassroots organizing. We love having, if it's parents or providers or the people that you serve, email or come to meetings or have a State House day. anything like that. Engaging the community, including your board members, is so important to this. Be persistent, succinct, and clear. We always say we have polite persistence. We never want anyone to forget about us. We want to share all the good work we're doing. We follow up and we always stay in touch with people. And last but not least, be aware of politics. I think we know we always need to be mindful of what is happening. Right now is an election year. That's something we need to be mindful of. And we're talking to people, knowing if they're going to be super busy because they're in a competitive race, if they're coming back next year or not. We always have to think about that. Last but not least, never, ever give up. That is one thing that we have learned time and time again. Even when you feel so defeated, there sometimes are a couple more stones you can unturn. Never, ever give up. So I'm going to ask Becky and Matt to come back on screen really quick, and we will answer some questions. Becky, I think this is a great one for you. Are there restrictions or specific requirements on funds received through federal earmarks or state operating budget dollars?
Yes, is the short answer. You know, it depends upon, we keep talking about the accounts. So, you know, at the state operating budget level, a lot of nonprofits go after TANF dollars, for example. Those are for, which is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. There are a lot of federal requirements and criteria around those funds. So you want to be aware of what those are. If that's, you know, if you're serving a TANF eligible population, if that's the right account for you to be considering or talking to. There's a lot of moving pieces, parts on that funding right now. So definitely something to be aware of. You know, other types of funding for the state operating budget is general revenue funding, which has a little more flexibility, but again, it depends on which state agency it's coming through and which criteria you have to meet federally. I was talking about those, the guidance that come out from the appropriations committees. Those that guidance does outline specifically some of the restrictions that are in place depending on which account you submit your project through.
Okay. We had another question that came through while we were talking about the state operating budget and asked, do policy advocacy activities qualify or just direct service? I assume by policy advocacy activities, we're talking more about like legislative or policy changes. Which I would say yes. So and Becky, I'm sure will have something to add here. The benefit of the state operating budget is that it is a moving vehicle, and that means that it absolutely will pass. You will see bills all the time that may not pass, that may go through every single hoop they need to go through, and right at the end they don't pass. So the benefit of the state operating budget is a moving vehicle. It absolutely will pass, and there are both you know, appropriations budget items on there, but also policy writers that will follow on there. So yes, both can qualify. I would also say it depends on what the issue is, what exactly you're looking for. Sometimes it is worth it to go more of a route just to focus on that policy activity. And if this is not the question, what the question was, please, please let us know. But yes, you can do both policy writers and budget asks on there.
Yeah,
then,
I agree.
Yeah. And then another question, what are some of the ways nonprofits can engage with us or with a firm in preparation before asking for resources in the state budget?
Yeah, so you are more than welcome to reach out to us directly, and we'd be happy to set up a conversation with you individually. And a lot of times your board members, you know, others in the community that do work with a government affairs firm will have suggestions on folks you should reach out to and have a conversation with them. You know, find out what their, how they operate, you know, what their process looks like. Lynette referenced ours a little bit in that we typically develop a strategic roadmap from the beginning. And, you know, we have a pretty a process in place that we find effective in working with our the nonprofits we work with. Andrea, I see, is putting our contact information in the chat. I will pull back up the slides here too, which I think has some of our contact information. But just ask around and see who others have worked with and have a conversation with them. But feel free to reach out to us as well.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, are there definitely things that we can look at? I know Dr. Lynette and Senator Tavares both mentioned this, but you really need to be aware of if what you're looking for, like funding wise, is something that is, I would say, fundable by the state. If you are in a place where you can get funding, there is a long preparation process that happens just to figure out where exactly you would fit in the budget, if you're going to fit into the budget, if there's that eligibility there. And then also relationship development. Right now, there are folks we're working with who have not yet gone to legislature or Congress or anything like that to ask for funding. And right now, because we're in a legislative break, we're just working on relationship development. Letting people know who they are and what they do and why, like I said before, they're going to be good stewards of public funding. So there are definitely things you can do. Preparation is so key. I say this all the time, but especially when we're looking at a state operating budget, starting in January, we are sprinting until June. It is busy, busy, busy. There are a lot of steps. So anything you can do to prepare for that in advance is going to help a lot. And I really think it gives you that runway to success to prepare in advance. We're right at, well, we're a little after 1 right now, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. If there are any other questions, all of our emails are in the chat. I am going to send the recording and the slides after this, and you are welcome to email any of us with any questions that you may have. We really appreciate your time. We love doing this. We love sharing with nonprofits. And again, thank you so much, Senator Tavares and Dr. Lynette. What a dream team to talk about advocacy. We're very lucky that we had you both today. Now, Becky, Matt, if you guys have anything to end with.
Nope, just want to echo Andrea. Thank you so much to Senator Tavares and Dr. Lynette, and thank you all for being here.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Becky said. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email any of us. We are happy to talk to you.
Thanks, everyone.